The body is found in a place most people never see, and few would choose to notice. A stretch of land on the city's edge, scattered with rusted metal, discarded appliances, and the residue of years of quiet neglect. It's an illegal junk site, one of many that exist in the gaps between enforcement and survival. And here, among the debris, lies Latrice Coleman. At first glance, the scene offers little clarity. No witnesses step forward immediately. No clean boundaries separate the site from the surrounding neighborhoods. This is not a crime scene that feels contained. It spills outward into questions about why Latrice was there in the first place, and why so many others pass through spaces like this every day without protection, oversight, or alternatives. Latrice is quickly identified as a scrapper, someone who made a living collecting and selling discarded metal in a city where steady work has become increasingly scarce. To outsiders, scrapping can look like scavenging. But for many, it's an economy of last resort, built from necessity rather than choice. The junk site where Latrice is found is not just a backdrop. It is part of the story, shaped by a local economy that has been quietly collapsing for years. As detectives begin their work, they realize this case will not fit neatly into familiar categories. There is no obvious robbery, no immediate suspect, no clear motive that stands on its own. Instead, there are layers of poverty, of environmental risk, of informal labor carried out in places the city has effectively abandoned. Latrice's death does not feel random, but it also does not feel simple. What soon becomes clear is that Latrice was not just passing through this landscape. She was paying close attention to it. In the days and weeks before her death, she had been documenting what she saw: unsafe conditions, exploitation, and the unspoken rules governing who could work where and at what cost. That attention may have placed her in the path of forces far larger than any one individual. This is where the story begins. Not with a single act of violence, but with a body found at the edge of an economy that operates in the shadows, one shaped by neglect, pressure, and the quiet understanding that survival often comes with risks no one else is willing to carry. To understand how Latrice Coleman ended up at an illegal junk site, it's necessary to understand the city she lived in and what had been slowly disappearing from it. Over the past decade, stable industrial jobs had vanished one by one. Warehouses closed, factories downsized, and the promise of steady employment thinned into something unreliable and out of reach. For many residents, especially those already living close to the edge, survival began to depend on work that existed outside formal systems. Scrapping filled that gap. It wasn't advertised, regulated, or protected, but it was available. Abandoned buildings, discarded appliances, and industrial waste became sources of income. Informal junk sites emerged wherever enforcement was light and desperation was heavy. These spaces were dangerous by nature: exposed chemicals, unstable structures, sharp metal. But they were also places where people could earn cash the same day. For workers like Latrice, risk became part of the calculation. Latrice was known as someone who worked consistently and methodically. She wasn't new to the scrap economy, and she understood its unwritten rules. Crews formed loosely, territories shifted, and everyone knew which sites were more dangerous than others. But the city's absence was constant. Environmental hazards went unaddressed, and complaints, when they were made, rarely led to change. The result was an economy operating in plain sight, yet largely invisible. This is the kind of story Beyond the Evidence focuses on, cases where the crime cannot be separated from the conditions surrounding it. If you're not already subscribed, this is a good moment to do so, because these stories don't end at the police tape. They begin much earlier, in the systems that shape who is protected and who is not. In neighborhoods near the junk sites, people learned to live alongside the hazards. Children walked past piles of debris. Residents adapted to the smell of chemicals and burning metal. Over time, danger normalized. What might have sparked outrage elsewhere became background noise here. Scrapping wasn't seen as a choice, but as a response to limited options. For Latrice, this environment wasn't just something to endure. It was something she paid attention to. She moved through these spaces with awareness, noting which conditions were getting worse, which operators were cutting corners, and how competition was intensifying as more people turned to scrapping to survive. The setting around her was changing, and not for the better. By the time she was found dead, the illegal junk site was already a symbol of deeper collapse. Not just environmental neglect, but economic abandonment. And that context would soon prove essential to understanding why her death could not be treated as an isolated incident. Within the informal scrap economy, no one truly worked alone. Crews formed out of convenience and necessity, shifting as circumstances changed. Some were built on long-standing familiarity, others on short-term alliances meant to share transportation, tools, or access to certain sites. Trust existed, but it was cautious and conditional, shaped by an understanding that survival depended on information and timing as much as effort. Latrice Coleman occupied a careful position within this network. She was known to be observant, consistent, and largely independent, moving between crews without fully belonging to any single one. That flexibility allowed her access to multiple sites, but it also meant she navigated overlapping territories where tensions were already simmering. In a system without clear rules, presence itself could be interpreted as competition. As more people turned to scrapping, the balance grew unstable. Sites that once supported several workers no longer produced enough to go around. Crews began to guard information about deliveries, abandoned properties, or newly dumped material more closely. Quiet disputes over access replaced open cooperation. Most of these conflicts never escalated beyond warnings or exclusion, but the pressure was building. Latrice was aware of these dynamics and took steps to avoid unnecessary confrontation. She worked during off hours, avoided disputed sites when possible, and maintained polite but distant relationships. Still, her movement between different areas made her visible. In an economy where anonymity offered safety, visibility carried risk. What set Latrice apart was not aggression or ambition, but attention. She noticed patterns others tried not to think about. How certain operators consistently pushed people into unsafe conditions, how environmental hazards were ignored when they slowed productivity, and how enforcement seemed to arrive only after something went wrong. Her awareness placed her in a complicated position, neither an enforcer nor an instigator, but someone who saw the system clearly. To the crews around her, this made Latrice difficult to categorize. She wasn't openly challenging anyone, but she also wasn't silent. In a fragile economy built on unspoken agreements, even quiet observation could feel threatening. Long before her death, the conditions for conflict were already in place, shaped less by personal animosity than by scarcity and neglect. In the weeks leading up to her death, Latrice Coleman's focus began to shift. What started as casual notes and photographs taken to protect herself slowly became something more deliberate. She documented unstable scrap piles, leaking containers, and areas where workers were being pressured to move quickly despite clear safety risks. These weren't abstract concerns. They were conditions that could seriously injure or kill someone. Latrice also began paying closer attention to how the work was being organized. Certain sites, including the one where she would later be found, were controlled informally by individuals who benefited from the lack of oversight. Workers were expected to accept unsafe conditions in exchange for access, with little room to refuse. Latrice noted how complaints were dismissed and how those who spoke up were quietly pushed out. There were early warning signs that her awareness was becoming known. She was cautioned, indirectly, to mind her own work. Access to certain sites became more restricted. Nothing rose to the level of a direct threat, but the tone around her changed. In an environment where silence was often the safest option, attention could be interpreted as defiance. What makes this period critical is that Latrice was not documenting with the intent to expose anyone publicly. There is no indication she planned to go to the media or authorities. Her actions appear rooted in self-preservation and concern for the people working alongside her. Still, documentation creates records, and records create risk in spaces designed to remain unexamined. Detectives would later view this phase as the turning point. It marked the moment Latrice crossed an invisible line, from someone navigating the system to someone observing it too closely. The danger did not arrive suddenly. It built quietly, through changed behavior, narrowed access, and the growing sense that Latrice no longer blended into the background. By the time her documentation stopped, the environment around her had already shifted. The junk sites were more tense, the competition sharper, and the tolerance for scrutiny thinner. These early warning signs would only become clear in hindsight, but together they formed the inciting incident that set everything else in motion. As the local economy continued to contract, the scrap yards and illegal junk sites became more crowded and more volatile. Materials that once provided enough income for multiple crews now barely sustained one. The competition was no longer just about effort or timing, but about control. Access to productive sites became guarded, and disputes that might once have been resolved through avoidance or negotiation began to harden. Detectives later reconstructed a pattern of escalating tension in the days before Latrice Coleman's death. Certain junk sites had become flashpoints, especially those with high-value materials and minimal oversight. Crews asserted informal ownership, enforcing boundaries through intimidation rather than agreement. The pressure to earn, combined with the absence of regulation, created an environment where conflict was not just possible, but increasingly likely. Latrice was moving through this environment at a moment when tolerance was wearing thin. Her presence at contested sites placed her near the center of growing disputes, even if she was not actively participating in them. Investigators would later note that violence in informal economies often emerges not from personal grudges, but from economic stress reaching a breaking point. Latrice's death fit that pattern. The crime itself occurred without spectacle. There was no public confrontation, no immediate outcry. She was found near the junk site, surrounded by the same hazards she had been documenting. The lack of witnesses and the familiar setting initially made it difficult to separate intentional violence from the dangerous conditions themselves. But evidence at the scene confirmed this was not an accident. What stands out to investigators is how unremarkable the moment seemed to everyone else. In spaces like these, injury and risk are routine. That normalization creates cover, not just for unsafe practices, but for violence. The same neglect that allowed hazardous conditions to persist also allowed a crime to unfold without immediate interruption. By the time Latrice's body was discovered, the escalation had already reached its endpoint. Economic pressure, territorial conflict, and systemic absence had converged. Her death was not sudden in its origins, even if it was abrupt in its outcome. It was a result of a system under strain, finally breaking in the most irreversible way. News of Latrice Coleman's death moved quickly through the scrapping community, but it did not spread loudly. There were no public demonstrations, no immediate calls for justice echoing beyond the neighborhood. Instead, there was silence. People returned to work cautiously, aware that attention could bring consequences they were not equipped to face. For those who worked the junk sites, fear was not abstract. Many depended on the same informal networks now under scrutiny. Speaking openly to police risked losing access to work, or was, drawing unwanted attention in an environment where protections were already minimal. Grief existed, but it was contained, expressed privately rather than collectively. Within the surrounding neighborhoods, the reaction was a mix of shock and resignation. Residents had long complained about the environmental hazards posed by illegal dumping, but few were surprised that something had finally gone wrong. Latrice's death felt tragic, but also familiar, a reminder of how closely danger lived alongside daily routines. Detectives encountered resistance that was not overt, but pervasive. Witnesses were hesitant, memories vague, timelines unclear. It was difficult to tell where fear ended and normalization began. Injuries and accidents were common in these spaces, and that blurred the urgency many might otherwise have felt. What complicated the aftermath further was the limited public attention. Without a clear narrative, the case struggled to break beyond local awareness. Latrice was not widely known outside her community, and the location of her death did not command sympathy from those unfamiliar with the realities of informal labor. Yet beneath the quiet, the impact was real. People adjusted their routes, avoided certain sites, and worked in tighter groups. The junk site where Latrice was found became both a warning and a symbol. Her absence changed behavior in ways that would later help investigators understand just how fragile the system had become. From the beginning, detectives understood that this case would not be solved through traditional assumptions alone. The physical evidence at the scene provided limited direction, and witness cooperation remained cautious. What emerged instead was the realization that the crime could not be separated from the informal economy surrounding it. To understand what happened to Latrice Coleman, investigators would have to understand how scrapping actually worked. They began by mapping the junk sites themselves, who worked where, when materials arrived, and which locations generated the most income. Patterns started to form. Certain sites drew repeated disputes. Others were quietly controlled by individuals who never appeared on official records, but exerted real influence on access and productivity. The investigation shifted from individuals to systems, tracing how scarcity and control moved through the network. Latrice's documentation became increasingly important. The notes and images she left behind provided context the detectives did not initially have. They showed which conditions were deteriorating, which sites had become more dangerous, and where tensions were rising. Her records were not accusations, but they revealed pressure points, places where conflict was most likely to occur. Interviews slowly began to fill in gaps. While few people were willing to speak openly, overlapping accounts confirmed that disputes had intensified in the period before Latrice's death. Detectives learned of warnings issued, access quietly revoked, and confrontations that never reached official attention. None of this pointed immediately to a single suspect, but together it painted a clear picture of escalation. What the investigation uncovered was not a hidden mastermind, but a predictable outcome. In an economy without oversight, conflict was managed informally, and violence became one of the few remaining tools of enforcement. Latrice's death fit within that pattern. The evidence did not just describe what happened, it explained why it became possible. By following the economy as closely as the physical evidence, investigators moved closer to understanding the full scope of the case. And in doing so, they uncovered something larger than a single crime, an environment where neglect had quietly reshaped risk into inevitability. As investigators continued to piece together the circumstances around Latrice Coleman's death, the focus widened beyond the scrapping crews themselves. Community advocates and environmental activists began to step forward, drawing attention to long-standing complaints that had gone unanswered. Illegal dumping sites had been reported repeatedly, yet inspections were rare and enforcement inconsistent. What emerged was a pattern of institutional absence rather than isolated oversight. Latrice's documentation became central at this stage. Her records showed that the hazards present at the junk sites were not new, nor were they hidden. Toxic runoff, unstable piles of debris, and unsafe dismantling practices had existed openly for years. These conditions persisted because the workers operating there had little leverage and few alternatives. The city's failure to intervene had effectively outsourced risk to the most economically vulnerable. Investigators also learned how exploitation operated quietly within this space. Access to certain sites came with unspoken costs, longer hours, faster work, and acceptance of danger without complaint. Those who pushed back were denied entry or forced to move on. Latrice's awareness of these dynamics, and her willingness to document them, reframed her role in the eyes of those benefiting from the status quo. Public attention slowly followed. Media coverage began to highlight not just a homicide, but the environment that allowed it to happen. Officials were pressed to explain why hazardous sites had remained active for so long, and why workers had been left to navigate them alone. The case became less about assigning blame to one individual, and more about acknowledging collective failure. These revelations shifted the meaning of Latrice's death. She was no longer seen solely as a victim of violence, but as someone whose work exposed a system operating without accountability. The crime did not occur in spite of neglect. It occurred because of it. And that understanding would shape how the case moved forward, both legally and publicly. The legal outcomes of Latrice Coleman's case arrived slowly and with measured finality. Investigators were able to establish responsibility within the context of the escalating turf conflicts, leading to accountability for those directly involved in the violence. The case moved through the system without spectacle, reflecting the same quiet urgency that had defined it from the beginning. But justice, as it unfolded, was narrow. Legal responsibility addressed the act itself, not the conditions that made it possible. The informal scrap economy remained largely unchanged, and illegal junk sites continued to operate in the spaces where oversight was weakest. For many in the community, the resolution felt incomplete, an answer to what happened, but not why it kept happening. City officials announced reviews and limited enforcement efforts in response to public pressure. Some hazardous sites were cleared, others temporarily shut down. Yet advocates noted that without addressing the economic desperation driving people into dangerous work, these actions offered only short-term relief. The structural issues Latrice had documented were still in place. For the scrapping community, the consequences were personal and ongoing. Behavior changed, but fear remained. Workers adapted once again, shifting locations, adjusting routines, and accepting that safety was still not guaranteed. Latrice's absence was felt not only as a loss, but as a reminder of how exposed they all remained. In the end, the case produced accountability without resolution. It closed a file, but left a system intact. The harm Latrice sought to record, and perhaps prevent, continued to shape daily life. Her death marked a moment of reckoning, but not a turning point. Latrice Coleman's story does not end where the investigation stops. It lingers in the spaces she worked, in the hazards she documented, and in the economic realities that shaped every decision she made. Her death forces a broader reckoning with how easily certain forms of labor and certain lives can be treated as expendable when they exist outside formal systems. What Latrice left behind was not just evidence of unsafe conditions, but a record of attention. She noticed what others had learned to overlook. In doing so, she exposed how poverty, environmental neglect, and informal economies intersect in ways that quietly push people toward risk. The violence that ended her life was not an anomaly, but a symptom of that intersection. Cases like this challenge how crime is understood. They ask whether responsibility ends with individual acts, or whether it extends to the structures that make those acts more likely. Latrice's death highlights the cost of ignoring environments where regulation fades and survival fills the gap. For viewers, the question becomes unavoidable. How many similar stories unfold without documentation, without investigation, without acknowledgement? And what does accountability look like when harm is built into the system itself? If stories like Latrice's matter, then awareness is only the beginning. The conversation does not end here. It begins with how society chooses to respond to the conditions that made this tragedy possible.